Story 1. The Silent Watcher in the Dark. The night was supposed to be an escape, a quiet, solitary retreat into the wilderness. After months of stress and isolation, Ethan Foster just wanted to breathe. The pandemic had turned the world upside down, but out here, in the deep forests of Rocky Pine National Park, none of that mattered. The air was crisp, the stars untouched by city lights, and the only sound was the distant rush of the nearby creek. He set up his tent, built a modest fire, and exhaled. This was peace. Or at least, it should have been. Ethan wasn't a novice camper. He knew how to pack light, stay alert, and respect nature's rules. He had spent enough nights under the open sky to know the sounds of the forest, the rustling of nocturnal creatures, the whisper of wind through the trees, the occasional snap of a distant branch. But as he sat by his fire, flipping through the pages of his book, he felt it. That deep, primal instinct that something wasn't right. He wasn't alone. At first, he chalked it up to paranoia. The woods were full of tricks, branches swaying like figures in the darkness, the wind carrying distant voices that weren't there. He shook his head and took a sip from his flask. Relax. But then his phone vibrated in his pocket. A message, a number he didn't recognize. "Enjoying your trip, Ethan?" The fire crackled as the chill spread through his spine. He stared at the screen, heart pounding. His fingers trembled slightly as he typed a response. "Who is this?" No answer. Seconds stretched into minutes, his grip tightening around the phone. He turned his head slowly, scanning the forest beyond his camp. There was nothing but the towering silhouettes of trees, their forms twisting in the flickering firelight. But he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. A second message came. "It's beautiful out here, isn't it?" Ethan's breath hitched. His pulse thundered in his ears. He stood abruptly, spinning in a slow circle, his flashlight sweeping across the clearing. His brain struggled for rationality. Maybe it was a prank, maybe a friend who had followed him without telling him. But no one knew he was here. No one. A third message. "I see you." The phone nearly slipped from his grasp. That was it. He wasn't imagining things. Someone was here. His survival instincts took over. He doused the fire with dirt, plunging his surroundings into near darkness. If someone was out there, he wasn't going to make it easy for them to watch him. He moved quickly, grabbing his handgun from his bag and securing the tent's entrance. His breathing was heavy, adrenaline turning his skin clammy. He sat inside the tent, gun in hand, his flashlight off. His phone screen was the only glow in the abyss of the forest night. He waited. And then... footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the frozen leaves just outside his tent. Ethan stopped breathing. The steps grew closer, each one more calculated than the last, as if whoever, or whatever, it was knew exactly how to make him suffer in the silence. Then, something flashed, a burst of light through the thin nylon walls of the tent, like a camera flash. His phone vibrated. A photo. Of his tent, taken from just a few feet away. Ethan's mind screamed at him to move, but his body was frozen, caught between terror and disbelief. His fingers clenched around the gun, his chest tightened, muscles coiling. He zipped the tent open in one violent motion, stepped out and fired 2 shots into the air. The forest exploded with the echo. The footsteps broke into a frantic sprint, retreating into the shadows. Someone was out there. Someone had been watching. Ethan's voice cracked with rage and fear as he shouted into the night, his breath coming out in sharp gasps. But there was no answer, no movement, just the silence swallowing his own voice. He stood there for a long moment, his hands trembling, before finally retreating back inside the tent. He locked his gun by his side and refused to close his eyes. The messages had stopped. The footsteps had vanished. But Ethan knew the night wasn't over. Somewhere out there, in the sea of trees, someone was waiting, watching, and they knew exactly where he was. Story 2. The Stranger in the Woods. The cold autumn air hung heavy in the dense forest, wrapping around the trees like a silent, unseen force. Daniel Carter tightened his grip on his flashlight as he led his younger brother Jacob and their 2 cousins, Matt and Owen, deeper into the woods. The flickering light barely pierced the darkness, casting long, twisting shadows over the mossy ground. The boys were on edge, but none of them wanted to be the first to admit it. They had come here for adventure, for the thrill of camping alone, far from the adults. But now, the silence of the woods felt suffocating. The plan had seemed foolproof at first. Their dads, already half drunk from an evening of beers and hunting talk, had encouraged them to be men and set up camp deeper in the woods. They even helped pitch the tent, laughing and teasing the boys as they worked. Their mothers weren't as keen on the idea, but after enough convincing, they relented. A night alone under the stars? What was the worst that could happen? But as Daniel zipped up the tent and gathered the others inside, something gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. It wasn't just the darkness or the isolation. It was a feeling, a crawling sense of being watched. He forced himself to ignore it, focusing instead on Matt dealing the first hand of Uno, their game of choice for the night. The cards slapped against the fabric of the tent floor, a comforting sound against the otherwise eerie silence outside. For a while, the game distracted them. They laughed, talked trash about each other's plays, and tried to shake off the unsettling stillness beyond the thin nylon walls. But then, just as Jacob was about to place a draw for, a sound split the night. A scream. Not an animal's cry, not the distant howl of a coyote. A human scream. High-pitched, filled with a raw, piercing terror that froze the blood in their veins. The boys exchanged wide-eyed glances, their breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. What the hell was that?" Owen whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Daniel swallowed hard. His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe one of the adults back at the house was playing a prank, trying to scare them. Maybe it was a joke. But something deep in his gut told him it wasn't. "Foxes," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Foxes sound like screaming women sometimes." The others nodded, grasping onto his explanation like a lifeline. It made sense. It had to make sense. But even as they continued their game, their ears were attuned to the silence outside, listening, waiting. And then it happened again. Closer this time. This time, the scream wasn't distant. It was right outside their tent. The Uno cards dropped from Matt's hands. Owen clapped a shaking hand over his mouth. Jacob whimpered. Daniel reached for the flashlight, his heart hammering against his ribs. His fingers trembled as he clicked it on and aimed it toward the thin fabric of the tent. The beam cast eerie shadows against the walls. Something was moving outside. The tent began to shake violently. A guttural, inhuman noise tore through the silence, a sound that sent pure panic coursing through their veins. Something, or someone, was outside, clawing at the tent, trying to get in. "Run!" Daniel shouted. They didn't hesitate. He unzipped the tent in a frantic motion, shoving his cousins forward into the night. The cold air slapped their faces as they stumbled into the darkness of the woods, their flashlights swinging wildly. Their boots pounded against the forest floor, crunching fallen leaves as they sprinted back toward the house. Behind them, something followed. Branches snapped, leaves rustled. The sound of footsteps, no, multiple footsteps, chased them, closing in fast. Daniel didn't dare look back. He knew that if he turned, he would see something his mind couldn't comprehend, something he wasn't meant to see. The house came into view, a beacon of light in the consuming darkness. The boys burst through the tree line, their terrified screams already sending their parents rushing out onto the porch. Their dads, still groggy from beer, grabbed their rifles, their faces twisting with concern as they tried to make sense of the pure terror in their son's eyes. "Someone's out there," Owen gasped, doubling over, his hands on his knees. They grabbed the tent. They were screaming." Without hesitation, their fathers stormed into the woods, rifles raised. The boys huddled together, shivering despite the warmth of the porch light. Minutes felt like hours. The men returned, their expressions grave. "There's no one out there," Daniel's dad said, but his eyes betrayed something else. Something unsettled. The boys didn't argue. They knew what they had heard. They knew what they had seen. But they also knew one thing for certain. They were never going into those woods again. Story 3. The Vanishing Elderly Couple. The bar was alive with noise. glasses clinking, muffled conversations blending with the deep bass of the music and the rhythmic hum of the espresso machine from the cafe section. Ethan Walker wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that evening, glancing at the crowd. It was a busy night, but that was nothing new. His shift at the Blue Haven was routine by now. Serving drinks, small talk, keeping the place in order. The clientele ranged from weary office workers to loud college kids, the kind that tipped poorly but made the night eventful. But then they walked in. At first there was nothing remarkable about them, just an elderly couple dressed far too formally for a place like this. The man, tall and gaunt, wore a black suit that seemed slightly outdated, like he had stepped out of another decade. The woman, equally pale, wore a navy dress with lace sleeves, her silver hair pinned into a meticulous bun. Something about their posture, their stillness, made Ethan pause. They weren't looking around like first-time visitors. They weren't searching for a table. They simply walked straight to the back corner booth and sat down without a word. Ethan assumed they were waiting for someone, maybe a late-night coffee date, a family member. He put them out of his mind and focused on work. But minutes passed, then an hour, and they still hadn't ordered anything. Ethan stole glances at them between customers. They hadn't moved. They weren't talking. The woman's hands rested delicately on the table, and the man's fingers were interlaced, unmoving. But the most unsettling thing? They were both staring at the wall. Not the menu, not their surroundings, just the wall. Something about them made Ethan's skin prickle. He wasn't the kind of person to get easily creeped out, but this felt wrong. When the crowd finally thinned out, Ethan took the opportunity to walk over. The silence in the booth was suffocating. He forced a smile, clearing his throat. "Evening, can I get you two something to drink?" Neither of them turned to look at him. The woman remained eerily still. The man, however, moved. Slowly, his head turned in an unnatural, deliberate motion, like a doll being wound up. When his pale, hollowed-out eyes met Ethan's, a cold weight settled in his stomach. A few seconds passed in silence before the man shook his head once. Not a word. No polite decline, no thanks, just looking. Just a slow, stiff shake of the head. Ethan hesitated, suppressing the overwhelming urge to walk away. "All right, just let me know if you need anything." Still no response. As he turned, he felt something. Off. Their presence weighed on the bar, like an unspoken tension stretching across the air. The sounds of the music and customers seemed distant, muted. Ethan returned to the bar, glancing back at the booth every now and then. But each time, they hadn't moved. Then, after a while, he noticed something that made his heart stutter. They weren't staring at the wall anymore. They were staring directly at him. His breath caught in his throat. The woman, whose face had been perfectly neutral before, now had a faint, unsettling smile. The man, still as stone, bore the same empty, sunken gaze. Ethan forced himself to look away. What the hell was wrong with him? As the night went on, he tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself he was just tired, imagining things. But every time he turned back to that corner, they were still there, watching. Until suddenly, they weren't. One moment they were sitting there, the next, the booth was empty. Ethan blinked. No way. He hadn't seen them leave. He would have noticed. They would have had to walk past the bar, past the customers, past him. But there was nothing. No sign they had ever been there. His stomach twisted as he made his way to the booth. The air felt colder here, like the temperature had dropped just in this one spot. He hovered for a moment, then reached down and pressed his palm to the table. Ice cold. A sharp shiver ran through him. That was enough. He turned away and forced himself to move on, pretending it hadn't happened. But the night wasn't over yet. As he and his coworker Karen closed up, Ethan decided to ask her about them. "Hey," he said, forcing a casual tone. "Did you see that older couple sitting in the corner earlier?" Karen frowned. "What couple?" Ethan's fingers tightened around the glass he was drying. "The couple in the last booth. They were there for hours." Karen gave him a blank look, "Ethan, no one's been sitting there all night." A heavy silence settled between them. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. He laughed shakily, trying to play it off. "You're messing with me." "I'm serious." Karen gestured around the room. "It's been college kids and regulars all night. There weren't any old people here." The hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stood up. He wanted to argue, to prove he had seen them, but he couldn't. There were no empty glasses, no plates, no signs that anyone had ever sat there. That night, as Ethan walked to his car, his mind was still racing. Maybe he was overworked, seeing things. Maybe Karen had just missed them somehow. Then he stopped dead in his tracks. Across the street, beneath a dim streetlight, stood two figures. The man, the woman. Their faces were shadowed, but he knew. It was them. Ethan's stomach dropped. His hands shook as he fumbled for his keys, his pulse hammering in his ears. As he finally got into his car and slammed the door shut, his breath came in quick, ragged gasps. The figures didn't move. They just watched. Ethan tore out of the parking lot without looking back. The next day, he checked the security footage. Nothing.
The camera facing the entrance never recorded them walking in. Or out. Ethan never saw them again. But he never forgot them either.
Life has a way of throwing us into the unexpected, and sometimes the scariest moments come when we least expect them. Whether it's being stalked by a stranger, having an uninvited intruder in your home, or witnessing something that simply shouldn't exist, these stories remind us of one crucial truth. We are never as alone as we think. From a simple night out that turns into a nightmare, to waking up and realizing someone has been inside your house, to encountering figures that seem to defy reality, fear takes many forms. These real-life horrors teach us the importance of staying aware, trusting our instincts, and never dismissing that uneasy feeling in our gut. Your safety can depend on one small decision: paying attention to your surroundings, securing your home, or simply knowing when to walk away. At Johan Co. Horror, we bring you chilling, true horror stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. If you love realistic nightmares, tales of the unexplained, and the most disturbing encounters, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and prepare yourself, because the next terrifying story might just happen to you. Are you ready?